Good evening, everybody. I have to apologize that I have quite a bad cold. My throat is quite sore, my nose is congested, but I will soldier on, so please bear with me. So today, I've got a bit of a history lesson for you. I hope you find it interesting, and it's very much about my history and my experience developing games from when it all started. But for me, it all started with these things. These are ancient board games, which you probably never heard of, apart from this one at the end, Dungeons and Dragons, because it still exists. But these hideously complex board games with massive rule books simply don't exist anymore. But still, this was my inspiration. This is what I was playing when I was a teenager. And I also made games. Obviously, there were no computers, so this is one of the first games that I made, which I called the Wizard game. And I still have this. It survives today, made from little cards, typewriter, pen and paper, the best tools a game designer can have. But round about this time, 1981, the home computer boom started in Britain. And this had two fundamental causes. One of them was this machine here, which is called the BBC Micro. And it was produced by a small company based in Cambridge called Acorn Computers, and they had only been in existence for 2 years when the British Broadcasting Corporation approached them to make a machine specifically for their computer literacy program, which was funded by the government. So it's a very unusual machine, and it was very expensive, by the way. I mean, it started at £335, went up to £399. In today's money, this is well over £1,000, probably equivalent to something like 2,500 or 3,000 levs in Bulgarian money today. And this is all it had: a 32K RAM, a CPU, keyboard, no monitor, no disk drive, a cassette interface. That's it. But it went on to promote computer literacy in schools. So there were several aspects to this. One is the BBC funded the making of the machine. There was a TV program called the Computer Program, and you saw these things in schools, and there were thousands of them in schools. Went on to sell well over 1 million. It also became a popular home computer despite its price. So computer literacy in the UK in the 1980s rocketed. In fact, it's never been so good. It declined long after that. But one of the interesting parts of this story is that Acorn went on to develop something very advanced for the time called RISC machines, or reduced instruction set computing. The simulation for the chip was actually made on a BBC Micro. They actually produced a computer, which is the first RISC-based home computer called the Archimedes, which for them was a commercial flop. It was very expensive. I had a friend who had one of these, by the way. He had almost no software for it. Still, he was very proud of his machine. But this led on, through a collaboration with Apple, to something called ARM, which are now probably the biggest designers of computer chips in the world. Roughly 60% of all chips in small devices, embedded devices, your phones today, designed by this company. So thanks to the generous funding of the British government and the British Broadcasting Corporation, you have these chips in your phone today. Now, it was a popular machine for home computer games as well, and probably the most famous of these, which you probably heard of, is Elite. It was released in 1984, and it was made by two guys, David Braben and Ian Bell. And it was distinguished by the fact it had 3D graphics, but these guys had to compress this game into a tiny 16K of RAM. Remember I said Model B BBC had 32K RAM, but it has 16K for the screen memory, 16K RAM for your code and data. And they did an amazing job making this vast, expansive game on this machine with such a tiny amount of memory. And Elite Dangerous, of course, was a game that they followed up with and released relatively recently. So here's my first attempt. So the first computer game that I designed was a game called Time Lords. I had a friend called Andrew. He had a BBC Model B. I didn't have a computer at the time. So I designed the game. It was designed as a pen and paper game originally. It had two versions. This is the second version using the text mode, and it's a time travel game, multiplayer game, very unique and original. Didn't sell very much, but still, that's my first attempt. My second game we designed was also for the BBC Model B, which my friend programmed, and that's about as far as I got with the BBC Micro. But then along came this guy. So here he is. This is Sir Clive Sinclair, a very eccentric inventor and entrepreneur. He started very early, so he's producing these devices, pocket calculators. Then the ZX80, which was released in 1980, is the first really affordable home computer. It was under £100. Couldn't do much with it. Had 1K RAM. And this is one of his later inventions, the C5 electronic vehicle car, what do you call it, which was, in fact, the biggest business disaster in British history. So he didn't get everything right. But yes, he was a mad, eccentric inventor, and still I owe a huge amount to him, as does the whole home computer industry in Britain. And part of the reason was this machine. So this is the first computer I actually owned. It's called a ZX81. I managed to buy mine second-hand for about £25, but it was very limited. So you had 1K internal RAM, completely useless, unless you had this thing up here, which is a 16K RAM pack. The only problem is when you plug this device in and you tap the keyboard, the connection got loose and it crashed your program. So for doing anything serious, is impossible. I had quite a few rage fits on this one. Though I did manage to learn assembly language, I did not manage to actually create anything sustainable on this machine. But it was fantastic for learning how to program. I remember getting up at midnight and plugging into the TV after my parents had gone to sleep and just coding stuff until I got too tired. So this is where I realized the amazing power of computers. But it wasn't until this machine was released that my career really took off. So this is the Sinclair ZX Spectrum, made in two versions. The 48K one is the most popular one. Had a relatively powerful Z80 central processor, in my view, much more flexible and powerful than the 6502 processor in the BBC Micro. It had 48K RAM, which you needed 7K was a reserve for the screen memory. So this meant you had a massive, huge 41K for your code and data. May not sound like anything today, but I can assure you at the time this was quite exceptional. Now, from what I wanted to do, which was translate those complex board games onto computers, for me, the amount of RAM was the most important thing. You'll also notice that it has a lot of codes here. So it had a built-in 16K ROM with basic programming language, which is very easy and accessible to use. Simply by pressing one or two keys, you can enter most of the keywords for the language. And again, it really helped young children learn to program. If you want to know a bit more about the story of Clive Sinclair and also Chris Curry, one of the founders of Acorn, I recommend you watch this documentary because it's very interesting and it's a very interesting story. But both of these men are responsible for perhaps creating one of the biggest game development scenes in the world at the time in the 1980s. Whoops, hold on. It was during this time we had something what's called the rise of the bedroom coder. These were basically young kids who were literally just holed up in their bedroom, making computer games and becoming very rich. One of the most famous was this guy, Matthew Smith, who released this game, Manic Miner. The first game that I actually bought, by the way, is Manic Miner. He made a sequel called Jet Set Willy, and then he vanished into obscurity. He went to live on some commune in the Netherlands. And when he got back many years later, he was just stunned to realize how famous he actually was. But there you go. So if you want to hear the story about the bedroom coders, I recommend this movie here, From Bedrooms to Billions, which is an awesome documentary about the early history of the home computer games industry. So I was one of these. I was one of the bedroom coders. I did everything. I programmed, I did the arts, I did the sound effects. I used little graph paper to draw all the sprites. I had to enter them as data into my assembly language compiler. But I didn't get as famous as him. Now, at the time the Spectrum was released, one of the things that made it really popular as a games machine is the games released by these two guys, Chris Stamper, Tim Stamper. They had a company called Ultimate Play the Game. I played almost all of these games, and they were amazing technically for the time. And one of the most popular ones they released, certainly the most technically advanced, I know it doesn't look much today, but here you've got Night Law. They called their technique filmation. So it was an isometric system that actually created a genuine three-dimensional environment for a player to explore. And it later influenced the development of the isometric style that I did in Laser Squad 2 and ultimately XCOM games. It's not the first isometric game, but it's certainly the most technically advanced and successful one. Now, interesting thing about Ultimate is that they then set up a company called Rare, which you've probably heard of, and one of the most phenomenal successes was Donkey Kong Country. So what Tim and Chris Stamper did was that they reverse engineered the Nintendo console, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, impressed Nintendo so much they made this game, one of the best-selling games of all time, 9 million sold, second best-selling SNES game. They invested a huge amount in 3D graphics at the time, the silicon graphics machines, which were very expensive, used to do all the 3D generated art for this game. So it was truly technically innovative. And they were later acquired by Microsoft. And they're still going today. Their most recent game is Sea of Thieves, which of course is a Microsoft game. And they were one of the big success stories in the 80s, big influence on me, as was this game. So this is the Lords of Midnight. And again, because of the Spectrum's huge amount of memory, you could do very complex and involving games like this. So this is like an RPG slash, I guess, war game, fantasy war game, which you could explore using a first-person 3D style perspective, technically very advanced for its time. And sadly, Mike Singleton died in 2012, but he was just working on a remake of this for the iOS platform, which you can buy today. Interestingly, when we were working on XCOM at Microprose in 1993, one of his games, Star-Lord, was in QA at the same time as XCOM. So I'm familiar with his game from that point. I only met him once, though, so huge influence on me. But this is my first effort on a ZX Spectrum, which is technically, as you can probably see, absolutely nothing like anything that Tim and Chris Stamper could do, or Mike Singleton. So I persuaded my dad to buy me a Spectrum for £125. So it's way cheaper than the BBC-B. And I promised him that I was going to make money with it. And I didn't let him down. So I programmed this using the ZX Spectrum built-in BASIC. I probably spent about 5 or 6 weeks on it, and it was published by Redshift, and did not too badly, but technically very primitive. But then I went on to work on probably what would be the genesis of XCOM, which is this game here, Rebel Star Raiders. Now, it's a very simple two-player game, again programmed in BASIC, single screen, but it had the squad-based, turn-based tactics. It evolved further with this game, Rebel Star 1 and 2, getting much more sophisticated as then programming in Z80 assembly language. And then Laser Squad, 1988. Many of the game systems in here went directly into XCOM. Had AI, had multiple scenarios, hidden units, line of sight, equipping, facing, and so on. But for Laser Squad, I set up a new company, Mythos Games, with my brother, Nick. So I was programming the ZX Spectrum version, and Nick was working on the Commodore 64 version of the game. And we're basically making and publishing the games ourselves, truly independent publishing. But we were working on all of these machines. So it's starting to get a bit crowded, the hardware market in the UK. So not only did you have the Spectrum, you had disk drive version of the Spectrum, the Plus 3. You had the Amstrad, which was the tape and disk version, the Amstrad CPC. Commodore 64. It wasn't hugely popular in the UK, but because it was very expensive. But for the 8-bit machines, it was certainly the most advanced, had a dedicated sound chip, joystick ports, hardware sprites, and so on. But then came the 16-bit machines. We invested mainly in the Atari ST, which is very similar to the Commodore Amiga. But we lost out a bit because we didn't start with the Commodore Amiga. And very soon, by the 1990s, the Commodore Amiga was the dominant machine in the UK by a big margin. But we did not decide to go all in on the Commodore Amiga. We had a completely different plan. So this was our plan. So we were choosing a new project in 1991. We had a demo for Laser Squad 2 on the Atari ST, and we wanted to find a publisher. Top of our list was Microprose, and the reason being that Railroad Tycoon and Civilization, which had just about being released, I think then in 1991, were mine and Nick's favorite games. We wanted our game, we wanted to make a game for this company. And we wanted to make it on the PC, because we believed that the PC was going to be the games machine of the future. Even though the Amiga completely dominated the scene in the UK. So we approached Microprose with the demo. Actually, one thing they said to us was, can you make it on the PC? And we said, yeah, of course, no problem. We'd never programmed in C, by the way. So we were used to 68,000 assembly language, Z80 assembly language, 6502 assembly language, but C, no. But we said no problem, because we thought it would be, having used all these assembly languages, we would be able to do it, no problem. So but what they wanted was something interesting. So Microprose UK were regarded as the toy department of Microprose. It's a bit of an insulting phrase, but they were mostly doing console ports, and they wanted something that can compete with the American division of Microprose, something as big as Civilization itself. So they said to us, you've got to make it a big game. And I said, well, what do you mean? They said, it's got to have something like the scale of Civilization, have a big research tree, Civilopedia. And they want us to use the theme of UFOs, because the guys at Microprose, they're big fans of this TV series called UFO. It's a Jerry Anderson live-action film. The aliens were very boring, but basically you had flying saucers coming down to the planet, and you had moon-based interceptors, air-based interceptors, and ground-based interceptors. And then if the UFO made it to the ground, you had to hunt them down, find out where the aliens were. So the idea of the organization in this TV series, Shadow, became XCOM in the XCOM game, this secretive worldwide organization that was basically there to intercept and research UFOs. So this was all good, all great. But I added a third ingredient, which I took from this book called Alien Liaison. So in this book, there was a really weird story about this guy, Bob Lazar, in Area 51, and about how the American government had captured UFOs and was reverse engineering them, and it was driven by this element 115, which we used as a lyrium in XCOM. Now, the interesting thing about this UFO folklore was that it fed into not only mine and Nick's game, but also into this well-known TV series called The X-Files, which was released in the US in 1993, shortly before our game came out. And I remember we were working on this game about 2 months before it was released, and we were at Microprose in Chipping Sodbury. One of the QA guys came in and he said, Julian, you've got to watch this TV series. It's exactly like your game. And I had no idea what he was talking about until I saw it, and I said, yeah. So it has these common elements from the sort of UFO folklore and this Bob Lazar stuff. And I guess we were kind of lucky with this because the popularity of the X-Files helped the popularity of the game, especially in the US. Interestingly, a couple of years ago, Netflix released a documentary based on Bob Lazar's wild claims. If you want to watch it, I recommend it. It's quite interesting. You can decide for yourself whether what he was saying is actually true. So we ended up with this complex and amazingly successful game. We were supposed to be working on it for 18 months, but it took us 2.5 years. It was nearly cancelled 2 times. But it had all these elements that made it a complex, big PC strategy game. The strategic layer, the tactical layer, which was developed from our Laser Squad game. And the rest is history. But this time, this period, so we're talking about the early 1990s, for both myself and Nick, this was like the glory time of these big, complex strategy games, the games that me and Nick really loved. Not just Civilization, but also Master of Orion and Master of Magic are really big favorites of mine. However, we were not going to see these type of games again because of this game, Dune. Although it was released in 1991, the RTS format didn't take off until the middle of the decade. So the problem with this was, after the success of these games on PC, the turn-based games kind of died out. And I remember going to the Game Developers Conference in the US, this was 1996. I was in a presentation when somebody was doing a lecture on pathfinding for games. And it was packed. There were hundreds of people in this room. And he said, how many people here are working on an RTS game? And I would look at like 95% of the people in the room put their hand up. There was a massive glut of these games. There were so many of them made that they became their own downfall, in fact. But it became very difficult for me to make the kind of game I was doing, which is turn-based strategy games. We did release a new XCOM game, so this is XCOM Apocalypse in 1997. It had a real-time mode. The graphics were ugly as sin, but here you can see it had destructible terrain, real-time smoke graphics, etc. Complex game. Was relatively successful. But during the development, we had a problem with our publisher. There was some dispute about who exactly owned the rights to the XCOM name. They obviously thought that we had some stake in it, and they were basically saying, well, if you don't give us the rights, we're going to cancel your game. So we managed to come to some agreement where we assigned them the full rights to the XCOM name, and in return for a higher royalty, basically, on XCOM Apocalypse. Now, it's clear that they were developing other XCOM games while they were negotiating this with us. None of them were successful, though. So here's one of them. It's called XCOM Alliance, which you may not have heard of because it was never actually released. They spent a huge amount of money on this. So Microprose was now owned by Hasbro and then Infogram. And I believe this was cancelled around about 2000, based on a very early Unreal Engine, by the way. So all of them were unsuccessful because they basically were not true to the original gameplay of XCOM. Then it went on. We signed a deal with Virgin. So we made this game as a real-time game, a bit of an RPG element. Used plasticine models, which were animated using the claymation style. We had a couple of guys who used to work from Ardman Animations working on this. I would not recommend this method of making computer graphics because it was absolute hell. It wasn't a huge success, partly because Virgin Interactive themselves were going down the tubes. They had to fund it so Bethesda published it in the US. Virgin were then sold to, I think, Interplay, and then Interplay was sold to Titus Interactive. It's a bad story. It's a mess. At the time, we were working on this, though. So this was actually a spiritual successor to the original XCOM. You probably never heard of it because it was never released. It had a 3D engine, first-person view, aiming view, which is a system that made it into Phoenix Point many years later. We had a 4-game contract with Virgin. We only made 1 game for them, and that was it. Our company was bust because they cancelled it. Now, although turn-based games were dead, they were revived by this guy, who was very persistent. XCOM license was bought by Take-Two, and then was given to Firaxis Games, which is kind of ironic since Sid Meier was the inspiration for working for Microprose. But they had a real struggle making this. They actually began working on this in 2005, and it wasn't until 7 years later that the XCOM reboot was actually released and was hugely successful, despite the fact it very much followed some of the game mechanics of the original game with turn-based gameplay. It proved that this style of game could be popular. But what I was doing in the meanwhile was something a bit different. So I had come to Bulgaria in 2005 and started working for Ubisoft, and the first game I was working on was this one, which did not really set my creative juices flowing, and it had really crappy graphics like these. But after a while, I managed to get an interesting project produced at Ubisoft Sofia. This was Ghost Recon Shadow Wars. So the pitch here that I made to the editorial board was, this is like an XCOM game in the Ghost Recon universe, but for Nintendo DS. And interestingly, it became actually a launch title for Nintendo's new machine, the 3DS. And it was nominated for a BAFTA, second highest rated 3DS launch title. Very cool project to work on. It still wasn't exactly a full XCOM game. Although it had turn-based tactics, it was very much going back to some of my earlier games like Rebel Star is probably the most similar one, the one which I did back in 1986. I worked for a while on this one, Assassin's Creed Liberation, as creative director, and we helped develop the story and background of this very interesting character, Aveline, the first female assassin. But again, I wasn't really working on game design. It wasn't really for me. And something else happened around about 2012 that made me realize that, yes, I could again strike out and become an independent developer. And that was this. So the rise of crowdfunding in video games really had a big boost with this game, which is Double Fine Adventure, which became Broken Age. And it raised a whopping $3.3 million through Kickstarter. And it convinced me, as well as many other people, that, yeah, you could raise money for games, especially if they're games that had been neglected by the modern computer industry, like turn-based games, for example, or point-and-click adventures, as in the case of Tim Schafer's Double Fine Adventure. So I set up Snapshot Games. So the idea was that we started a very small team. So here's my co-founder, David Case, based in the US, founding of Game Insiders, been involved in games a long time. Bobby Bogdanov, who is the actual lead artist on Ghost Recon Shadow Wars, and Sergey, who is our technical director. A very small team. We put this together pretty much at the time we were doing the crowdfunding. And you may remember this little game that I showed you at the start, this little card game that I made back in 1981. Well, it so happened that in 1985, I made a computer version of this game called Chaos the Battle Wizards, which was published by Games Workshop. And it was a complete flop, largely because Games Workshop only sold it through their own stores. However, I did something interesting. This game was actually on a cover tape of a magazine called Your Sinclair 2 times. Now, cover tapes were a big thing in those days, and Your Sinclair was the biggest selling home computer magazine. And because my game was on cover tape, it became very well known in the UK. Nowhere else, but only in the UK. So it became a bit of a cult title. And I thought this would be actually a good game to base my first crowdfunding game on, because I thought it would reach an audience that would be prepared to pay for it. So our first project, Chaos Reborn, crowdfunding began March 2014. Here's the demo that I made. It's a multiplayer online demo, and one good thing that I managed to do was to get Total Biscuit, who died recently of cancer, but he was a very popular YouTuber, and Ken Levine of BioShock fame, to have an online game with me on Total Biscuit's YouTube channel, which massively helped our crowdfunding campaign. If you see our crowdfunding campaign, this is what it looks like. Here's our goal. It was looking very, very iffy at this point. Here was the point at which actually it was about here that we had the video with Total Biscuit, and that pushed us over the edge. So by the skin of our teeth, Snapshot Games burst into existence with Chaos Reborn. Then our second game, Phoenix Point. So we made many attempts to raise money with Phoenix Point, but we did return to crowdfunding. But we returned to crowdfunding with a new crowdfunding system called Fig.co. The interesting thing about this is that it allowed players to invest in the game. You can buy sort of $500 shares in the game, and you get a share of the game's profits. It was very successful for us. We actually, it says here, 320K raised from investors. It actually went up to 500K. All of these guys have actually made their money back already, by the way, with some profit, which is great. And then beginning our development. We had a bit of controversy with the Epic Store deal. As you know, there's been a real shake-up in the PC games industry in the last year or so. Mainly caused by Epic Games and their new store, but also through Microsoft's acquisition of many sort of medium-sized studios and their Game Pass service. Things are changing very rapidly. So from our point of view, despite the internet hate mobs who think that the Epic Game Store is basically some Chinese spyware, this managed to, well, basically, it secured the future of our company, put it bluntly, so we can go on to develop more things. And what's next for us? Well, we have a lot of DLC planned for Phoenix Point. It's not the end of the road for Phoenix Point by any means. We will have new projects coming up. We are over 50 people now, and we're still a completely independent publisher and developer of computer games based here in Sofia, Bulgaria. So, thank you very much for listening. I guess
yes,
we don't have any time for questions.
Maybe we have for one question.
Does
anybody really want to ask a question?
Yeah, but you can ask me tomorrow, Mira. Okay, go on then.
Did the players of the original kills also hated the RNG?
No, they
RNG?
absolutely, they were, for them, it was the defining characteristic of the game. And so that's where you had the crowdfunding audience who really liked the RNG randomness, but the modern player, the modern gamer who can't cope with it because they're lily-livered pansies. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, let's thank the father of XCOM and Snapshot Games for being here with us today. Thank you very much, Julian.
Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, now we just need a few minutes to set up our next speaker. We'll be right back.